Casey, they're ready. This woman and I met in 1990s, so like decades ago. But she did a great article about farm. So that's our Hammerstrom connection from when she worked at the Daily Herald. So since then, she's gone on to survive cancer and do a lot of good, continued her writing journey, which she's going to talk about tonight. And then currently she also does Substack, which is something some of us know about, some of us don't. It's a way for writers and other people to get their words out. And you can subscribe or you can do it for free, different elements. So anyway, I'm thrilled. She lives in Wapaka, close enough that we can snag her maybe again sometime. So, Nikki Kallio.
Thank you. Thank you, Casey, for bringing me here, and thank you to the Wisconsin Prairie Chicken Festival. I'm so excited to be a part of it. So I thought I would talk a little bit about my writing journey and kind of my connection with Franz Hammerstrom and also with environmentalism in general. I am primarily a sci-fi writer, so this is my short story collection, Finding the Bones. It came out in 2023 through Cornerstone Press at UWSP, which is a really, really great press. And the students all work on everything from the cover design to the editing, and they're learning how to be in the publishing industry. And it's operated by Dr. Ross Tangadal, who is the leader of the program. They used to have one book a year. They're up to, I think, 30 or 40 now. Yeah, they really have a great operation there. But it's mostly Gothic fiction, so ghost stories, some sci-fi, some speculative fiction, which is sort of a soft sci-fi, more like societal. Like Handmaid's Tale would be speculative fiction, whereas something like Star Trek would be a hard science fiction. So yeah, there's some stories in there. But so you might wonder then, what's my connection to nature? What's my connection to Franz Hammerstrom? So what I'll do is I will read a little section from one of the Substack articles that I wrote for the Climate Fiction Writers League. That explains a little bit about it. Let's just say I wasn't among those intrepid young undergraduate students who have it all figured out. Even by the time I was approaching graduation in 1993 with a cobbled together degree in social science, I still had unclear ideas about my future. I'd always had notions about writing someday, but had vague ideas about how to make a living at it. I figured maybe I'd go on to grad school to become a therapist. And maybe one day I'd publish a children's book, one that I was noodling around with at the time. It seemed foolhardy to go to school just for creative writing, and I was trying to develop a practical way to earn an income. So I'd meandered through the past 5 years of my undergraduate program, slowed down in equal parts by indecision, by taking a part-time year to earn money, and getting distracted by things like, getting married. I still had a general degree requirement to fill, so I settled on a natural resources class, because why not? Imagine my surprise when my future suddenly appeared, vibrant and sharply focused. This natural resources course, taught by a team of 3 professors in the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point's College of Natural Resources, was designed as an overview of ecological concepts and concerns for the general student population, and that is my textbook, which I kept. The course began with the history of North America and the impact of westward expansion and resource exploitation by white settlers. It covered the philosophies of preservation, conservation, and environmentalism. It discussed the impacts of pollution on ecosystems and on human health. I remember the professors issuing warnings about potentially devastating climate change, drought, powerful hurricanes, shifts in the weather, all happening within a few decades, like everything we're seeing happen now. For my impressionable younger self, this new knowledge and concern took hold in ways that left me reevaluating my education and taking a sudden plunge into my creative side. In a letter to a friend I wrote about 3 years after the course, I said, "The instructor started talking about what things would be like in the future if we didn't change things now. And it must have been the right time in my life that the things I learned sank in and my imagination took off. A week into the course, I had my book started." I imagined a dystopian story centered on a found family in northern Minnesota trying to protect a patch of land in the midst of climatic chaos and conflict, each with their own ideas about the best way to do it. At the time, I didn't have the literary vocabulary or the experience to describe what I was writing. The term cli-fi came later, climate fiction. I was engrossed in the manuscript for years, improving it as my skills developed, but as rejections gathered, I ultimately moved on to other projects. But it was the novel that taught me to write novels, the manuscript that showed me that a world of creativity exists in parallel to the physical world. I'm grateful for that class, which was far outside my major, and my comfort zone for helping to send me down a trajectory I barely could imagine at the time, giving my natural inclination for writing and creativity something to grab onto. It offered me not just one, but two professional pathways to follow. I ended up working as an environmental reporter, and then I have my fiction career as well. I'd like to think I would have eventually developed a concern for the environment anyway. Maybe at the time I chose the class, my boomer parents' influence had finally started to register, despite my having been a fairly indifferent Gen X teen in the glitzy, conspicuous, consumerist 1980s. Once, when I was still in high school, my mother signed us up for a Saturday recycling pickup, pre-municipal recycling days. It was a way some students fulfilled a community service requirement. My mom just thought it was a good thing to do. I was at a loss to explain to the other kids why I had to give up a Saturday morning of sleep for this when I didn't have to. Later, my mother volunteered at a wildlife rescue, and our basement was often occupied by ravenous baby squirrels or chittering raccoons. My father always had a green thumb, a trait which still sadly eludes me, and is a waste-conscious do-it-yourselfer, building more than one of our homes himself and keeping them in good repair. Consciously or not, maybe all of these factors led me to choose the natural resources class instead of something else. So that was from Substack. Has anyone seen Substack so far? Casey has. So it's basically, it's kind of a combination newsletter and blog and social site. And more writers are going to it. You can publish your newsletter that actually goes out by mail, but it's also on the site so people can just visit it. And you can also send it out within the site, sort of like a tweet in a way, and then people can find you. And they can interact with you. And you can have different settings. Like for now, I have some paid subscribers, some free subscribers, and so you can have extra posts for the paid subscribers, or you can add special things like video if you want. But you can set it up pretty much any way you want. But it's getting popular. It's getting pretty popular. So the Climate Fiction Writers League has their own Substack. I have my own Substack. There's other groups on there, interest groups and things. So it's pretty nice. Okay, so that's my textbook from back in the day, and the interest stuck. So later that year, my mother and I took a trip up to the UP through Mosquito Hill Nature Center, and it was just to see the migration. I think it was in April or May. So there's a nice little barred owl, just like my textbook, almost, except that was That was a spotted. So that was in 1993. And that was also that was a camping trip that I took through through Mosquito Hill Nature Center, winter camping with one of my best friends, and that was maybe not as fun, but we did it. I wrote a column about that too. And then later on, I was involved in the Central Wisconsin Wildlife Center. That was in Stevens Point here. This is Snag. He was a resident owl. He had been injured and could not be released, so he was an education bird. And in the summer of 1995, I was an intern at the Wildlife Center, and my job was to walk Snag around so that he got used to being held, and he could go to programs for schools and parks and different things in the community, and he helped educate people about owls. And so there's me walking Snag, and in the back is my friend Katie Riley, who is still a very good friend, and her bird is Gaia, a barred owl. And so that's a picture from the Stevens Point Journal. They came out and did a profile of the volunteers. I had my owl shirt on too. I think I still have it. No, it's in a quilt. And so that is me with a red-tailed hawk named Skydance. And I was kind of borrowing him from my friend Carrie. Carrie was mostly responsible for Skydance. But we did a number of shows. We did shows at the Central Wisconsin Wildlife Center, and we went out into the community as well. And there's my really, really bad picture of prairie chickens. I did go out one morning with a neighbor who was a student. He was in wildlife biology, and we went out and we looked for prairie chickens, and we found them. But that's a 1990s telephoto and low light, so not very good. But it proves I was there. And that is the article that I wrote about Fran. And this article was probably one of the first that I was really, truly proud of as a young reporter. I had wanted to become an environmental reporter since that class. And you can't usually just jump into being an environmental reporter. You have to do the, county government reporting, maybe the schools, and, and just spend a lot of time doing, all of the reporting that you do when you're learning how to be a reporter. And then I think it was later this year that I officially became the Wausau Daily Herald environment, agriculture, and health reporter. It's all related. So I was very, very proud to write this article. If you take a look at it, it's up here. We have a laminated copy. And it was really wonderful to meet her, because I don't even remember exactly when I first learned about Fran Hammerstrom, but I am sure that I knew about her before I went out there. And I don't, Casey, did you call us and tell us she was there? Or yeah. So then we were able to do the feature, and I know that I had read her books prior to going. The University Connection. I'm sure that I learned about her in class or from classmates who had worked with her. My friend Carrie, who usually worked with Skydance the bird, she was one of Fran's helpers. So I know that she spent time out there. But I was really excited to meet her, and I was so impressed by her life and just the way that she basically shunned the society that she had been born into and came out here because she wanted to study wildlife with her husband. And it was just, it was really impressive for me, especially as I think a young female in a career that still was mostly men, to hear from her and how she had broken into this field, well before any women were in it. And so that was really one of my favorite articles that I could do. And she was fun to talk to. She's very direct, always said what was on her mind. And she invited me to come back out there and visit her and Dion. And so I did that after the article came out. And I remember because Dion and I had been talking about painting, and I had been starting painting at the time as well, I brought out a painting that I was working on, and I showed it. And Fran, she said, "My, isn't it interesting to see where this one is going?" And I thought that was kind of fun, and I was, young, and was happy that she said that. And so I said, yeah, it is. And, and she just gave me this look like, and that was kind of funny. So, yeah, but I was really happy to be able to visit her again and see, how she lived and to hear some of her stories. And so that was very, very impressionable for me. Yeah, and so I continued writing, covering a lot of things like there were a couple of issues with in the Wausau area with a power line that a group wanted to install. It was like a very, very high voltage power line, and so I covered a lot of the meetings about that, and I covered the citizen groups who were against it, and wrote a few things about how it might affect agriculture, the dairy cows and things like that. I'm trying to think of other things that I wrote about. A lot of things, water quality, different health issues. There was one that I did out in the Wisconsin Rapids area with a young person who had developed osteosarcoma, and there were several other young people who also had developed osteosarcoma, and so we wrote about that, and they had wondered if it could be a cancer cluster, and I think at the time it was inconclusive, and I don't know if there were follow-up stories after that, but I'm sure that there were. But yeah, I was very glad to be able to have that role, and I ended up going out to the Portland, Maine Press Herald, and I became a columnist and editorial writer, and I focused a lot on environmental issues. I also wrote a lot about social justice, and I did that for a few years. And then after a while, it just the desire to write fiction just grew very, very strong, and I wanted to go back to school for my MFA, and my workplace at the time was not conducive to giving me any time for that. So I left, and I found a different job on the other coast. I went out to California and became a copy editor at a newspaper that was smaller, just so that I could go back to school. But that was right before the Great Recession hit, and newspapers were hit very strongly. And it just became too difficult to do both. And so I ended up going home and working full-time on my MFA program, but I had intended to quit the MFA program and just work. And I called my parents one night and said, that's what I'm planning to do, because I can't continue this. I'm working so many hours because we can't hire people. And then my dad started telling me about an Elvis movie. And I said, Dad, I'm having a crisis here. And he said, no, just wait. He said, he and my mother were watching this film starring Elvis, and Elvis was in this scene with a young woman. They were standing by a swimming pool, and the woman had a suitcase full of cash and dropped it in the swimming pool, and the cash is floating away, and she was screaming, and Elvis gave her that Elvis look and just said, "It's just money." And so I thought, if my dad, the financial advisor, is telling me it's just money, I'm going to go to school. And it was the best thing I ever did, honestly. So I'm truly glad that I did that. I ended up moving back home, living in my old bedroom that I had when I was 17. And at the time, I was writing a novel that was just not working. And I discovered that the reason it wasn't working was because the protagonist needed to be a young adult. And I was in the perfect setting to make that happen. So that's something that is still in the works, but that's what you do is you write a couple of novels and then you get one published after you write a few. So there is a novella in the end of Finding the Bones, but it is short stories. Some of them won a few awards, and I will read to you from the first one, which is called Geography Lesson. He paced down the inner corridor, heading to the place he thought she might be, rolling a piece of sea glass in his hand. Odd, maybe, that he still panicked when she went missing, because she could never really be lost. At least they hadn't left their human instincts behind. It wasn't the first time he had found her here. She was too smart to be captivated for long in the classroom with the other children. No, she wanted to find her own answers. Have you been here the whole time? She looked so small, her skinny kid limbs folded on the floor in the adults' library, paging through the old books. The other children preferred to keep themselves occupied with animal films and flying games, or pressing their faces against the viewing portals and watching the stars go by. But Fiona was so much like her mother, or the mother she would have had. Maybe it was one of the worst things that he couldn't satisfy her curiosity. He thumbed the piece of sea glass, his talisman, his worry stone. Don't you want to be on the field trip with the other children? No, I've seen the goats. What are you looking at? She looked up at him from the old green volume, one of his own that he'd contributed to the library. They had only brought about 4,000 printed books, but also had in electronic storage every book that had ever been digitized. He loved the printed books like Fiona's mother had loved them, but every time he saw them, he wondered about the weight and the space and whether they could have brought more people instead. But they needed a history. They needed a history and a culture to bring with them from Earth. Without those things, they were flesh and bone and brain matter and excrement. She showed him the page she was on. Bergerac, commune, Dordogne, southwest France, on Dordogne River, population 27,165, wine, 19th century Gothic church captured by English, 1345, and fortified, taken by French in 1450. Berkemen, city, North Rhine, Westphalia, West Germany, 10 miles northeast of Dortmund, population 43,585, coal mining, chemicals. I want a baby, Leah had told him. They'd gone camping just after the call came, before the public announcement. They decided to go to the ocean. They were standing on a high rocky ridge surrounded by tall pines, and he wished he could remember the scent of those trees. He could remember the way the strong wind barely moved them, but he couldn't smell them anymore. He remembered the misty ocean droplets on his cheekbones, but he couldn't conjure the salty fish smell of the water. It was there that Leah had found the piece of sea glass and pressed it into his palm. He had held her tighter, feeling suddenly tiny, a molecule, in a cavernous maw of unpredictable space. You're mad, he had said. You want to watch it burn to death with everyone else? An embryo, she said. We'll send it with the others. He remembered how her hair had twisted around his neck in the wind, but he couldn't remember the smell of her hair. And I will go forward a little bit. There were lots of places on the ship to run around, to explore. It had been built to be child-friendly. The library was for adults, but mature children like Fiona could go in. There were playrooms and classrooms, and the greenhouse room where the food was grown was another kind of learning center where children could build their own salad farms. The livestock areas were often the most interesting, where the goats were milked and the milk taken to the dairy room where they made cheese. The children liked collecting eggs from the chickens and laughed when the rooster crowed and the little chicks were born. They liked watching the waste get ejected into space. Is anyone left on Earth? I don't think so, he said. Maybe. But it's dark and cold, she said. Everything's dying. Even the rivers? Yes. A river is skinny water and an ocean is wide water. How could he tell her more and make her understand? How could he make her know what a river really was? He could show her the map, the photographs, but the long grasses that lined the banks, the water bugs, the old fishermen in banged-up duck boats wearing dirty mesh baseball caps, waving ancient rods that dripped spidery lines into the muddy water. Fiona had seen grass, they grew it for the goats, but she had never seen tall weeds spiking out of the sandy bluffs. She had never felt them scratch her ankles. She had never rolled up her pant legs and waded into shallow streams, trying to scoop minnows into an empty spaghetti sauce jar. She had never tried to see the minnows through the camouflage of sunlight that floated on the tiny ripples made by her feet. She had seen the ocean in documentaries and had an idea how vast it was, but she would never stand next to one, never know how much she would dwarf, how small she would feel, and incongruously how large she would feel when she danced to the power of the waves. That's right. An ocean is wide and a river is skinny. Why are you on the ship and not there? Why did you get to come? He took a long time to answer. Just lucky. Am I? Am I lucky? So that's part of geography lesson. Yeah. Thank you. I was thinking today that all of the influence that I've had in terms of the things that I've learned ecologically, environmentally, I think it shows up in my writing either in creating these descriptions where there is a connection to nature or in storylines that are connected to nature. But even when it's a story that's set in space, I still have that connection, I think, in many ways. And I do see that appear through my writing. And I think that's part of what makes for vivid writing is vivid scenes and having that emotional connection. And I think it's there with the environmentalism and the ecology that I've spent some time with. So yeah. See, how much time do we have?
There's still time.
This time. Any questions? I have more to read, but any questions so far?
I love the
Yeah.
simplicity of the river is skinny and the ocean is wide.
Right.
Which reminds me of Ron sometimes could take something very broad,
Mm-hmm.
but then focus it and make it a simplified statement so people non-scientific could even understand.
Right. And she had influence on so many people because just in looking back over that article, something like 7,000 people stayed with her when they came to, yeah, and getting up early to look for prairie chickens. And so think about how much influence that she had and how many people that she could inspire that way. And so she probably had a lot of people that, weren't familiar with, wildlife as much as she was. And so, yeah, she has a good way.
We do a breakfast at a barn.
Yeah.
With the farmer connection to this, and one of the menu items has to be eggs.
Excellent.
To follow through.
Excellent. Yeah. Dennis, you had one?
The pictures of with you and the owls,
Yes.
I was thinking about Fran. When you visited Fran, did you get a chance to run on the front porch and eat for Prairie and the owl?
I must have. Yeah, I believe I did.
But he might have just been on the porch.
He might have been on the porch, yeah, because the name is familiar. Thanks for that. That's a good memory. I appreciate that.
Every time we went out there, she said, if you find some roadkill, pick it up.
For Porphyrio.
Picked it up in the refrigerator, and there was dead
Yeah.
mice and rats in
Oh my goodness. And I just love that she had the net to pull across the opening to the library to keep the owls out. That's just my favorite. I want a net just to remember that and keep it in my library.
Drive around just with plastic bags in my car. For
Yeah.
that very reason.
Hmm. That is something. Yeah. Any other questions right now? I think I had a few more pictures. Uh-oh. I don't know if we lost it. There, okay. Let's see, yeah. So that's me up in the Boundary Waters area of Minnesota, That was around 98, 99, maybe a little bit later, but I spent a lot of time up in that area as well, just exploring. And I had the first novel that I was working on was set in that area, so I wanted to just get the feel for it, and I spent a lot of time outdoors. And then eventually I had my other book published. That was an exciting day to get that box. Yeah. Oh, and then, yeah, I got to spend some time. Has anyone done these Natural Resources Foundation field trips? Yeah, yeah, they're really great. They have a catalog that comes out every spring. We just signed up for the trips this year. This is Jean Jacobs and a little Saw-Whet, so I got to spend some time with the Saw-Whets again. But they have trips everywhere. I mean, they start in April, they go through October, maybe even November, I think. Yeah, it was November, because last year my aunt and I, we went out to the Mississippi River and we did the migration tour. That was, I think, it was like a one-day tour, and we stayed out there. But that's another way that I have been staying connected with the outdoors and natural resources, and just trying to get some updated education on things, and spend time with my aunt, who loves to go too. And that's her. Her name is Jane. We were out actually at the Buena Vista Marsh there, but we were doing the Kestrel program, where they take you around and they do the banding and they weigh the kestrels, and you can hold the kestrel and get your picture taken with the kestrel. But you go from site to site to site and just see how the kestrels are doing. And there's one. Yeah, and I had done that a long time ago too, in the 90s. I found some old pictures when I was digging through my hoard. So, and there's just a nice picture of the marsh. It was warm that day. And I try to get out hiking as much as possible, and that's a photo from, I think that was Hartman Creek. Yeah. And yeah, I still paint a bit, abstract. And there is my social, that's on Instagram and Facebook, so you can find me on Facebook, and that's my Substack. Over there are some little cards, and they have my website on there as well. It may be down right now because we're redoing it, but it's there. And that is a picture of me, I think, at Dells of the Eau Claire, maybe, in the 90s. So there's that. I could read some more from Finding the Bones, and I have some new stuff as well. Never read before in public. Really? Oh, good. Okay. Here is a short story. I have some flash fiction pieces in here. Flash fiction is generally fiction that is 1,000 words or less, and it has a story that is sort of the chunk of the story, the meat of the story, and there are things that happen before, and there are things that will probably happen after, but it's just very, very condensed form. So this is kind of related to geography lesson, but not really. It's called The Last Day. He had said that thing I didn't want him to say. They had planned for people to change their minds. There were others who were willing to take my place. I loved him, but not enough. Now, though, standing here on this landscape that took 3 years to see, I could only think that he would have loved to see it. That last day I had wanted to visit Cannon Beach, so we were there, in the heavy mist and green morning sea stacks partially hidden by hanging fog, while his Labrador chased at foam and fragments of driftwood. We watched the dog. I can't, I told him, and his resignation thinly covered his resentment. But he held my hand and we made footprints in the wet sand, and I thought, this is all that's left of me here. My thoughts were a mix of how I'd never hold his hand again or feel this ground or breathe this air, and how much I was glad for it. After the beach, we ate at an outdoor cafe overlooking the water wordlessly, and I fed pieces of chicken to the dog because I couldn't eat. In a few hours, I would get on a bus and be taken to the facility, where we would make our final preparations, and that would be it. We weren't the first to go, but we would be the first colonists. We would be the ones to make that place permanent, to establish the base for exploration, for mining, at least, and then to see if we could grow more than scars. It was counterintuitive to believe we could breathe anywhere else, but one by one, we had unlocked the mechanism that sealed our helmets. The air was just a little bit different, and we could both feel it and taste it, minutely heavier and sweeter, like orange blossoms after a storm. We could only describe things in terms of what we knew. With time, we would begin to build a new language. Though we had brought with us so little, we would always have our human instincts. We had learned to live with each other for 3 years in a tight space, and now that we had an entire planet, it suddenly felt overwhelming and claustrophobic at the same time. We felt small. Some of us dropped to our knees, overcome by this thing we had accomplished, or a knowing that this was really it. We weren't going home. Or maybe it was just relief because really it had been a long and terrible trip. Our joy was tempered by the first task at hand, to scratch through the fine soil and bury the 2 who had died in transit, one to cancer, one to suicide. The procedure for disposal was supposed to be ejection, but we couldn't bear to do it, to leave them adrift, forever floating in a silent nothingness, unremembered. So that's the last day. Yeah. More? More? Okay. All right. I will read to you from the science fiction story novel that I am hoping to complete a good draft of this year. And the only few things that you need to know for context is the main character is half human, half alien, and she has the ability to leave her body. And this ability has been exploited by a ruling government. And this is a little bit of her history. She's among the first born of human and Andrian unions, and they are just learning about this ability that they have. It's called The Last Ghost Alive. The first time we discovered we could leave our bodies, we were underwater. We were the first of the offspring born of the union between the people of Andros and of Earth, myself and the twins Karina and Hedron. And that summer we began to transition from childhood into something not yet adult. We couldn't have fathomed how much our lives were about to change, how much we would need each other. We only sensed the slow progression of time. Long before the humans came to us, the Tarsians had been visiting our moon to stare at their own planet, to see its striations from afar, and watch the motion of the equatorial storms, seemingly so gentle from a distance. Our moon was lush and green and filled with steep mountains, covered in rainy forests that were so dense and fast-growing that my Andrian grandmother said if you stood in place too long, you would be swallowed up by climbing vines, never to be seen again. These mountains plunged toward our seas, and most of our villages and cities were built along the widening coastlines. Our moon looked like an emerald jewel as it circled Tarsus, which dominated our horizon and our lives. But sometimes, during certain rotations, our view was free from the large planet, and we would see our beautiful purple nebula unobstructed. In rare times, our sky was empty, when even the reflections of the barren moons were absent on the glassy sea. On these nights, my mother would gaze into the dark sky and say, "Look, Sid, we belong to our own universe tonight." At the time, I thought it was lonely, the thought of being on our own, and I didn't understand why she might wish for it, when there were so many other worlds to explore, including my father's. I deeply longed to visit Earth, this mysterious place where my father had been born, to witness for myself its many different nations and with even more languages, more than I could imagine, its contradictions and beauty, its strangely different environments, like a galaxy contained on one planet. My father would tell me about growing up on his homeworld, and I would feel like it belonged to me too. "It does belong to you, Sid," he'd say. "It's in your blood." I began to believe in this idea that something could belong to me because it was born inside. And I think Karina and Hedron had the same sense, that they were heirs to an unknown kingdom, and we love this idea because even happy children seek a place to call their own, where they are their own kings and queens. From the time we could swim, the 3 of us spent our afternoons diving from the cliffs, seeing the spiny rockfish that clung to underwater twists of volcanic stone, something we'd done nearly every season since we could swim. We would haul briny buckets of them to the vendors who took them to restaurants where visitors could dine on the delicacy while they watched the sea. We would always reserve some for my grandmother, who cooked them better than anyone and paid us just as she would a vendor. We grew up powerful and strong, learning to hold our breath and dive deeper, learning to develop an underwater language all our own, and maybe that was the first indication that we began to communicate in an almost uncanny way, not realizing that we were beginning to sense each other's thoughts. The day it happened, a storm was approaching, pushing the sea by increments into a swirling menace that threatened to throw us into the rocky shoreline. Hedron chose to dive once more, and he went deeper than any of us had ever gone. When he failed to resurface, Karina and I glanced at each other, hesitant, unsure of our strength against the encroaching sea. We dove in unison in the direction that Hedron had gone, somehow knowing that his foot had been caught. It all happened quickly, but it felt like an endless dream. Somehow Karina and I located him together, managing to free his ankle from a narrow crevice. The expression on his face was strangely calm but startled, like his mind couldn't process what was happening. And we didn't understand why until we swam with Hedron toward the surface, past our own limp bodies floating without us in the chaotic sea. So, that's it, yeah. That's the last ghost alive. Yeah. Yes, Dennis.
How did you hear about the UW Press, and how did somebody go to them to say, hey, I have a book I think you might be interested in?
Yeah. I have known about Cornerstone since I was a student, and someone recommended that I go there with my manuscript, which I'm glad that I didn't, and it's not published, but later. They've been in existence for 40 years. They just had their 40th anniversary last year, and there was a friend that I met through a contest that I had been in. One of my stories had won second place in the contest, and he had won first place. And it was the year that I was sick, and so I couldn't go, but we connected by email. I couldn't go to the reading that they had down in Madison. But we kept in touch, and he said, look, I'm getting my collection published by Cornerstone. Why don't you look into that? And so I sent my stories that I had to Ross, and he said, they're great, but we need more. There's not enough. And I went, oh. And that's when I finished the novella, and I said, how about this? And so they added the novella to the collection. But yeah, they're always looking for Wisconsin writers and those with a connection to the Midwest. Absolutely. And you can just reach out to the Cornerstone website, which is on the UW Stevens Point website. And I think they have an email on there that you can just click. And I think Ross is the one who reads everything too. So.
And I think Mary Croft started that.
Mary Croft.
Dan Dietrich.
Yep, Mary Croft and Dan Dietrich. Yep. Yep, Dan was at the gala for the anniversary celebration. Yeah. Yes. Oh my. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's such a powerful prompt, and I know that professors are still using that because it not only it gets you to practice your writing skills, but it gets you to think about your life and what you want too, doesn't it? Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions for me? Yeah.
You've got some books for sale?
I have some books for sale, and I'm happy to sign them. I'm selling them for $20 tonight. Yep, and I can do cash, I can do credit card, I will take a check. So thank you for listening, I appreciate it, and yeah, nice to see you. Yeah, thank you.
And we've all seen the LEVA program, so what I'm going to suggest is buy a book if you want to buy a